I remember how, not so long ago, my parents announced that we would be moving to a new state. They seemed excited, while I felt a knot in my stomach. I was 15 and about to start at a different high school, which already sounded like a lot to handle. The houses in our new neighborhood were arranged in neat rows, each with a tidy lawn and a driveway that seemed to say, "Everything here is perfectly normal." I tried to convince myself that nothing about this move was strange, but the minute we stepped inside, I felt an unexplainable tension in the air, like someone was watching from a hidden corner. Maybe it was just the nerves of leaving my friends behind, yet I could not shake the sense of stepping into something unknown. When my parents led me upstairs to pick my room, I felt a flicker of excitement because it was the largest bedroom I had ever been offered. They told me I deserved a big space to settle in and study for my new classes. At first glance, the walls looked freshly painted, and there was plenty of room for my bed, desk, and books. Then I noticed the closet. It was deep and well organized, but near the back, partially concealed by extra insulation, was a small door. It was only about knee-high and looked like it led into a crawl space or an attic-like nook. The thought of it made my skin prickle. It reminded me of scenes from a movie I had watched where a character finds a hidden passageway with something eerie inside. Despite my unease, curiosity took hold, and I slid the insulation aside to study the door more closely. The wood around the frame felt rough and unfinished, as if someone had stopped construction halfway through. The lock on the door was especially weird. I had expected a latch or a simple sliding bolt on the outside, but instead the lock was on the inside. It felt backward, almost like it was meant to keep something locked in, rather than keep people out. A wave of cold crept over me, despite the fact that the attic space felt much warmer than the rest of the house. The unusual heat just added to my suspicion that this was no ordinary storage area. My first thought was to tell my younger sister what I had found, but I knew how jumpy she could get. The house was still full of boxes, and she had already claimed the smaller bedroom across the hall. Whenever I joked about ghosts or anything spooky, she would pale and hurry off. Still, I eventually mentioned the hidden door, expecting her to be just a little curious. Instead, she flat out refused to come near my closet. She said it was the kind of thing people in horror stories discover before everything goes wrong, and she wanted nothing to do with it. My parents responded differently when I shared my discovery during dinner. Mom glanced at Dad with an amused look, then teased, "Maybe our house came with a friendly ghost." They shrugged off my concern and told me it was probably just a quirk of the house's construction. They seemed to believe I was letting my imagination run away with me. I wanted to press the point, to tell them about how uneasy that door made me feel, but I also did not want to come off like a child with an overactive imagination. So I kept my growing questions to myself. That night, as I settled into bed, my thoughts kept drifting to the strange attic space behind that little door. I imagined what might be hidden inside: old photos, maybe a forgotten trunk, or possibly nothing at all. Yet each time I tried to calm my mind, the unsettling design of that lock drifted back into my thoughts. I could not stop picturing it. Thick metal, placed where a person on the other side would have complete control. I told myself it was simply an odd piece of hardware, and nothing more. Still, I struggled to fall asleep, unable to escape the faint, persistent feeling that something about this house was out of place. I woke up the morning after our first night in the house with a strange heaviness pressing on my mind. When I glanced at the closet, my heart nearly skipped a beat. The small door was open by a crack, even though I could have sworn I'd closed it firmly before going to bed. At first, I told myself I might have been too tired to remember properly, but a nagging feeling told me That was not right. Something about that door looked different in the soft morning light, as though it had been nudged from the inside. I tried not to panic, but I still marched downstairs to ask my parents if either of them had been in my room while I slept. They both gave me blank stares. Mom insisted she had not left her bed once all night, and Dad teased me with a grin, accusing me of sleepwalking. My younger sister overheard us and blanched. She quickly backed away when I mentioned the attic-like space, reminding me in a shaky voice that she wanted nothing to do with it. Her reaction made my parents chuckle, but I could see that her fear was genuine. That day, I tried to investigate the door more thoroughly. I moved the insulation to one side and peered inside the attic room, hoping to catch a clue about why it was so oddly warm. The air smelled faintly of wood and dust, and the unfinished walls looked dull and uninviting. Even so, I felt an irresistible urge to slide my hand over the threshold, as if I might discover a hidden latch or a secret compartment. When I found nothing obvious, my eyes settled again on the inside lock. There was no denying how unsettling that design was. It felt more like a sealed room than a simple storage space. My parents continued to brush off the topic of the door, saying that it was normal for older houses to have quirks. They reminded me that the place was not exactly new, though the paint and floors appeared modern. Still, it was difficult for me to explain why it opened on its own every night. Each time I brought up the lock being on the inside, my parents shrugged and joked that I was conjuring ghost stories out of boredom. I hated how easily they dismissed my concerns. The door kept opening, morning after morning. I made sure to push it shut before bed. Once, I even wedged a small chair against it, but every dawn, it stood ajar. My sister refused to check for herself, while my parents only laughed and suggested I keep a dream journal. Their disbelief stirred something hot and unsettling in my chest, like I was bearing the weight of a mystery no one else would recognize. I began second-guessing my own memory, but I was sure I had closed that door thoroughly each night. As the days wore on, my sense of unease grew. I would stare at that door before turning off my bedroom lights, sometimes summoning enough courage to jiggle the knob just to prove to myself it was secure. I was determined to figure out what was going on behind that warm, unfinished wall. Yet as certain as I was of my senses, I could never explain how the latch ended up shifted by sunrise. The more I tried to reason it away, the more the door seemed to mock me with its quiet, unassuming presence. The next time it opened, I knew I had to confront this mystery head-on, even if my parents and sister wanted no part of it. I had trouble sleeping for several nights in a row, constantly thinking about that small door and the stifling heat behind it. Every time I dozed off, I would jerk awake and check the closet, worried that I might catch it opening on its own. My nerves were worn thin, and I found myself jumping at the smallest noises in the house. It felt like every creak of the floor or gust of wind was trying to warn me that the attic space was not as empty as it seemed. One night, after struggling to drift off, I found myself half awake and completely unable to move. My arms, legs, and even my eyelids seemed weighed down by an invisible force. In the corner of my vision, I saw a shape, a dark outline that sat right on the edge of my bed. It was roughly human, though I could not make out any features. I tried to scream, but my mouth refused to open. The room felt both freezing and boiling all at once, and the tension in my chest squeezed my lungs so tightly I could barely breathe. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but the figure's presence felt very real. I could sense it leaning closer, as if it were studying me in my vulnerable state. My heart pounded so hard, it sounded like rushing water in my ears. I do not remember how long I lay trapped in that silent terror, but it felt like hours. Suddenly my muscles unlocked, and I gasped for air. The shadowy figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The next morning I tried describing what happened to my parents. My voice shook when I talked about seeing something on my bed, how it vanished the moment I could move again. They offered a few consoling words, but ultimately brushed it off as a nightmare. I tried to explain that it felt so much more intense than any simple bad dream. My father just patted my shoulder and said, "It must have been the stress of starting at a new school." I nearly told him about the open door again, but I knew it would just fall on uninterested ears. When my younger sister heard about my experience, she shuddered and looked paler than I had ever seen her. She said she believed me but was too scared to talk about it for more than a few minutes. Her eyes kept drifting to my closet, as though she expected something to burst out at any second. Still, she flatly refused to go into my room to investigate, and I could not blame her. Even though I tried to tell myself the figure was a product of exhaustion and stress, I could not ignore how it left me trembling and certain that something was seriously wrong. By the end of that week, I found myself at the brink of desperation. Each night, the door would open despite my efforts to latch or barricade it. Every evening, I would lie in bed, listening for the slightest creak of the closet. My parents' dismissive attitude and my sister's fearful avoidance left me feeling isolated. I tried placing a chair under the doorknob and even scattered a few boxes around it to sense movement. But the small door always managed to be ajar by morning. I knew the situation could not go on this way forever, not when I was too afraid to close my eyes. The next time that eerie door opened on its own, I was determined to find a real, lasting solution, no matter how small or makeshift it might have to be. I knew I had to do something drastic. When I woke again to find the small attic door wide open, my heart sank with the sight of it, as though the house itself were taunting me. The last few nights had made one thing clear. No amount of pushing furniture against the door or checking the lock was enough. It was always open by dawn. I could not count on my parents to take the situation seriously, and my younger sister was too terrified to even look at the door anymore. It felt like I had nowhere to turn except my own determination. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed an old scarf from the back of my dresser drawer. It was long and thick, with enough length to wrap around the doorknob several times. Then I tied the other end to a sturdy shelf inside the closet. I felt strange, like I was rigging a trap for something unseen. At the same time, the very act of securing that scarf brought a rush of relief. For the first time in many days, I believed that I might finally keep the door closed until morning. I remember lying in bed that night, unable to calm my racing thoughts. The attic space seemed to radiate warmth through the closet. I kept visualizing the knot of the scarf holding firm, imagining any tug from the other side. The phantom figure from my sleepless nights hovered in the back of my mind, but I tried to push away the memory of its dark shape. Instead, I focused on the scarf and told myself that this simple barrier was stronger than any invisible presence. It felt like a small victory, one I hoped would be enough. When morning came and I opened my eyes, I looked straight toward the closet, bracing myself for disappointment. But the door was still closed. The scarf was in place, the knot undisturbed. I let out a sigh of relief, so intense that my arms shook. For the first time since moving into that room, I had proof that I could control whatever was happening, at least enough to stop the door from swinging open on its own. My parents shrugged when I told them about my makeshift solution, almost amused by the idea of a scarf holding back a ghost. My younger sister, however, nodded quietly, relieved that the door stayed shut. Over the next days and weeks, I repeated the ritual every single night. I would carefully tie the scarf the same way, pausing each time to ensure the knot was secure. The door remained closed every morning after that. Though I still felt uneasy sleeping in that room, the sense of powerlessness faded. The dark figure never appeared again, or if it did, it was confined behind that locked attic space. Sometimes I wondered if the warmth in the closet had lessened, or if I had simply grown used to it. My parents barely noticed my routine, and my sister tried to pretend all was normal, hoping to forget the whole ordeal. Eventually, my family decided that we would not stay in that house for more than a few years. When we prepared to move again, I found myself untying the scarf for the last time. Standing in the now empty bedroom, I could feel a lingering presence, like the memory of every unsettling night spent listening for that little door to rattle open. Even as we packed the last boxes and I left the house behind, I knew the experience would stay with me. I never did learn the full truth of what was hidden in that attic-like space, but the thought of that lock on the inside, the stale warmth beyond the threshold, and the silent figure at my bedside will remain in my mind for a very long time.